This is King World News. I'm Eric King, and you're about to hear an incredible interview with Congressman Grayson discussing corruption at the Fed, the SEC, and his tough questioning of Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke this week. Before the interview, you will hear a brief clip of Congressman Grayson's exchange with Chairman Bernanke. For more interviews, remember to go to our homepage at www.kingworldnews.com, where we will have Eric Sprott and Jean-Marie Avallard.
There's a table on page 26 which consists of your balance sheet. And one of the entries on the balance sheet is under assets, central bank liquidity swaps, which shows an increase from the end of 2007 from $24 billion to $553 billion in change at the end of 2008. What's that?
Those are swaps that were done with foreign central banks. Many foreign banks are short dollars and into our markets looking for dollars and drive up interest rates and create volatility in our markets. What we have done is, with a number of major central banks, like European Central Bank, for example, we swap our currency, dollars, for their currency, euros. They take the dollars, lend it out to the banks in their jurisdiction. That helps bring down interest rates in the global market for dollars. And meanwhile, we're not lending to those banks, we're lending to the central bank. The central bank is responsible for repaying us.
So who got the money?
To financial institutions in Europe and other countries.
Which ones?
I don't know.
Thank you for joining us, Congressman Grayson. You've been asking some tough questions of Federal Reserve Chairman Bernanke very recently. You asked Mr. Bernanke, what happened to $500 billion? And I have to say his answer was not very impressive. He basically said, we don't know where it went or what happened to the money. What are your thoughts on his answer?
I think it illustrates that the situation is out of control. You know, when we're looking at appropriations bills in Congress, we could end up arguing for 15 minutes over $100,000. And here we're talking about $500 billion, and he doesn't know who got it. It's just out of control. The Federal Reserve needs to be reined in.
Before we move on, I just want to play another clip of your exchange with Chairman Bernanke.
Well, look at the next page. The very next page has the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate, which shows a 20% increase in the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate at exactly the same time that you were handing out $500 billion to foreigners. Do you think that's a coincidence?
Yes.
You talked about a significant rise in the nominal dollar exchange rate at precisely the same time the Fed was giving out that money. What did you think? Because Mr. Bernanke's answer was just that it was sheer coincidence that happened at the same time. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, I laughed out loud just as you just did. I don't know how anybody could think that $500 billion in dollars handed out to foreigners is not going to have any effect on the exchange rate. It could, and it did. And that's what we saw. And for him to claim it as a coincidence is absurd.
You quoted the Constitution stating no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. And Bernanke responded this money was not drawn from the Treasury. But you asked him essentially, is what the Fed has been doing in the spirit of that law for the FOMC to hand out $500 billion to foreigners without any action by this Congress? And Bernanke said that in 1913, Congress approved it in the Federal Reserve Act, is what he said.
Well, it's our money. This is $1,500 for every single human being in America, and more than that. And I think that we're entitled to have some say and not have these things decided by 12 people sitting around in a room secretively making these decisions for us on our behalf and then spending our money. Whatever the Federal Reserve issues, any way you look at it, it's our money. And we're responsible for making good on it when it's handed over to foreigners the way that he did. I was shocked by it. I still am amazed that such a thing is even possible, that they can hand over $500 billion of our money to foreigners. This is 10 times the annual State Department budget. It's about 30 times the foreign aid budget. And they just simply decided, 12 guys sitting around in a room one day, that they were going to hand it out to foreigners and not even know who was getting it. It's amazing. It's shocking.
Is Jim Rogers correct when he says the Fed is immoral and should be abolished?
Well, the Fed in its present incarnation is immoral and needs to be controlled. There's no doubt about that. Before September last year, what they did was pretty clear-cut and almost impersonal. When they wanted to increase the money supply, they went into the market and bought government bonds and paid for them with cash. That's how they did it. And it's like you going and buying 100 shares of Microsoft. You don't know who's selling it to you. You just tell your broker, get me 100 shares. You don't really care who's selling it to you. Since last September, they've operated in an entirely different manner. As I explained, they gave $500 billion to foreign banks without any sort of accountability or follow-up. They have also handed out billions of dollars to their favorite banks here in the United States without even telling us who got the money. A few months ago, I asked the Inspector General of the Federal Reserve Bank, Elizabeth Coleman, who got that money, and she said, I don't know. And I believe her. I don't think she knows. And this is the Inspector General of the Federal Reserve Bank. We're talking about $2 billion on their balance sheet, off-balance sheet transactions that total about $2 trillion on their balance sheet. But in any event, we're talking about staggering sums of money, and even the Inspector General doesn't know what happened to this money. So things are just wildly out of control. They're doing things they never did before in the name of emergency, and they're doing things without congressional authorization or any participation by anybody who's responsible for being elected. It's fundamentally anti-democratic.
Let's talk about what you just mentioned there. They're doing things in the name of emergency. What are your thoughts on how Paulson and others strong-armed Congress on the bailouts and kind of rammed those down? There were rumors that martial law was going to be declared if this didn't go through, and I'm not privy to that. But what were your thoughts on how that whole thing was handled and what they're doing in the name of emergency?
Paulson had a $700 million conflict of interest. He owned $700 million in Goldman Sachs stock when he became a Treasury Secretary. He actually did it to get the tax break. I don't know if you know this, but if you're appointed Treasury Secretary and you've got a position like he did, which consisted largely of shares in one company, then you're allowed to sell those shares without paying capital gains taxes. So basically he got a $100 million tax break for taking the job. Then once he was in the job, he found that the value of his shares dropped from $700 million to below $500 million and heading south. So he became very concerned about that. And if you look back at what he did, begging us to engage in this bailout, which I voted against, by the way, begging us to do all these things to help his friends, what you realize is that every single thing he did while he was Treasury Secretary was governed by one rule. That rule was what's good for Hank Paulson.
Congressman Paul, and you have been trying to get the Fed audited, and of course there's some threats coming back that, well, if we do this, then the dollar can go into free fall and the interest rates would spike up, and this would really harm the American people if everything that the Fed does is uncovered. Doesn't that strike you as a bizarre statement in response to an audit of a Fed?
It really is, and I'm really pleased that members of this House are not falling for that. This is a bill that Ron Paul introduced, this bill that's currently H.R. 1207, the bill for the first independent audit of the Federal Reserve, and since the Federal Reserve was started over 90 years ago. This is a bill that Ron Paul introduced in 1983 when I was still in school, and it's never passed. Now people are seeing the chickens have come home to roost. This is an organization that has acted completely without oversight, completely without control, keeping us all in the dark, and they've handed out enormous sums of money to their friends. The example I give is if they gave $1 billion to the Dick Cheney Savings and Loan, a fledgling organization that consists solely of one Swiss unnumbered bank account. If they gave out $1 billion to the Dick Cheney Savings and Loan, we wouldn't even know about it. We wouldn't even know. And that's how bad things have gone. So I think it's time to find out what's really going on. That's why we need this audit. And I lined up 100 Democrats on my side of the aisle to support this bill. I was the first Democrat to sign on to it, and I didn't just sign on to it myself, but I have literally walked around with copies of this bill on the floor of the House now for weeks and gotten 100 Democrats to join as co-sponsors of this bill. We're now up to 277 co-sponsors, which is more than half, actually more than 60% of the House of Representatives. So now we've shown that this is something with bipartisan support, and I think it's become a model on how to do things in a bipartisan manner that are simply good government.
The media likes to say that nobody saw this coming, but there were many investment professionals, even a couple that I had on the show this week, Eric Sprott, Jean-Marie Avallard. But cumulatively, I think between them they manage about $30 billion, who chronicled the madness of this leverage. And you're a level-headed guy, Congressman Grayson. I can't believe that you and others as well just didn't see the madness of this leverage that led to this collapse.
Well, sure. We had a warning only a few years ago with the long-term capital situation when a hedge fund took on 100-to-1 leverage and ended up going broke and requiring a $4 billion bailout, which these days seems like loose change or even a rounding error. But that was a warning as to what happens when you allow hedge funds unlimited amounts of credit. And that's essentially what we did with AIG, what we did with Fannie Mae, what we did with Freddie Mac. In the case of Fannie Mae, they only were required 55